The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal at 11:47 p.m. like an announcement nobody wanted to hear. Flight 2214 to Portland. Final boarding call. Nora Callahan didn't hear it. She was asleep in a plastic chair at gate 14B with her head tilted against the cold glass of the window, her boarding pass still clutched in her right hand, her left hand resting on top of a carry-on bag she had packed in 12 minutes at 6 a.m. that morning between the end of a double shift and the beginning of the worst phone call of her life. She had been awake for 31 hours. The call came at 5:52 a.m. Her brother Daniel's voice, flat in the way voices go flat when they are carrying something too heavy to hold with any expression. "Nora, it's Mom. You need to come home." She hadn't asked how much time. She already knew. She had been a cardiac nurse for 9 years. She knew what "you need to come home" meant when it came at 5:52 in the morning in a voice like that. She booked the ticket on her phone in the hospital locker room with her scrubs still on and her hands still smelling of antiseptic. She changed in a bathroom stall at the airport. She bought a coffee she didn't drink. She sat down at gate 14B to wait for her 10:15 p.m. boarding call, and she closed her eyes for just one moment. That was 4 hours ago. The gate closed at 11:49 p.m. Flight 2214 to Portland pushed back from the terminal at 11:53 p.m. and climbed into the dark above Chicago without her. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the kind of tired Nora Callahan was carrying that night, because it matters for everything that comes after. There is ordinary tired, the tired of a long week, a bad night's sleep, a day that asked too much. Most people know that tired. Most people have a name for it. And then there is the tired that lives underneath ordinary tired. The kind that doesn't come from hours awake but from years of giving. The kind that builds in people who show up every single day in rooms where the worst things happen to the best people and absorb the weight of those rooms into their bodies like a sponge that is never fully wrung out. Nora Callahan had been carrying that second kind of tired for 9 years. She was 34 years old. She had worked the cardiac unit at Northwestern Memorial since she was 25, first as a floor nurse, then as charge nurse on nights. The shift nobody wanted, the shift that asked the most, the shift Nora had chosen specifically because she knew the nights were when patients were most afraid and most alone, and she could not stand the thought of someone being both of those things without anyone sitting beside them. She had held the hands of strangers at 3 a.m. She had called families with news that rearranged their entire lives in a single sentence. She had memorized the particular silence of a room after a monitor flatlines, and she had learned how to walk back out of that silence and into the next room and be fully present for the person in the next bed who needed her to be. She did this 5 nights a week, sometimes 6. She had not taken a vacation in 2 years. She had not been home to Portland in 14 months. She had meant to go at Christmas, then at Easter, then at her mother's birthday in March. Her mother had told her not to worry. Her mother always told her not to worry. Her mother was the kind of woman who spent her whole life making sure everyone around her had what they needed before she ever looked at what she needed herself. That, if you want to understand anything about this story, is where Nora learned it. She woke up at 12:17 a.m. to the sound of a cleaning cart rolling past her row of chairs. For 3 seconds she didn't know where she was. She felt only the cold of the window glass and the stiffness in her neck, and then she looked down at the boarding pass still in her hand and the gate number on it and the empty jetway beyond the glass, and she understood all at once what had happened. She went to the counter. The gate agent was sympathetic. She was also very clear. The next flight to Portland didn't leave until 6:10 a.m. and it was fully booked. There was a 7:45 with 2 seats available. She could get Nora onto that one standby, no guarantees. Nora stood at the counter and did the math she had been hoping not to do. The funeral was at 10 a.m. Portland time. The 7:45 landed at 9:20 at best. The cemetery was 40 minutes from the airport on a clear day. There were no clear days in Portland in November. She would not make it. She had worked 31 hours and packed in 12 minutes and flown halfway across the country, and she was going to miss her mother's funeral because she had fallen asleep in an airport chair. She thanked the gate agent. She walked back to the row of plastic chairs. She sat down. She put her boarding pass on the seat beside her. She pressed both hands flat against her knees, and she looked at the dark, empty jetway through the glass, and she breathed very carefully in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she had taught 100 patients to breathe when the thing in front of them was too large to look at directly. She did not cry. Not yet. She had learned a long time ago that grief, like a cardiac event, needed to be managed in the acute phase before it could be processed. You stabilized first. You felt later. She was still in the stabilizing phase. She didn't notice the man sitting 2 seats down until he spoke. He said, "Portland." Not intrusively. Not the way men in airports sometimes spoke to women sitting alone at midnight, with an angle, with an agenda. Just the word. Quiet. Like a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Nora looked up. He was perhaps 45, perhaps a few years older, sitting the way some people sit in airports, as if they are entirely comfortable being invisible. No laptop open, no phone in hand, no newspaper unfolded. Just a man in a dark coat with a carry-on at his feet and a paper cup of coffee balanced on one knee, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time alone and made some kind of peace with it. He was not remarkable looking. That was the first thing Nora registered. Not in the way airports sometimes threw remarkable-looking people at you in the middle of the night, as if to remind you that the world contained more than hospital corridors and departure boards. He had dark hair, gray at the temples, a jaw that was set but not hard, eyes that were, she would think about this later, the specific color of patience. He was looking at the same empty jetway she had been looking at. "The 2214, he said. "You missed it." "I noticed," Nora said. He nodded once. He didn't say "I'm sorry" the way people said it when they meant "I am now going to stop paying attention to your problem." He just nodded, and he looked back at the jetway, and there was something in the gesture that acknowledged her situation without trying to resolve it, and Nora, who was very good at reading people after 9 years of reading them in the worst moments of their lives, recognized that as a rarer quality than it sounded. "There's a 7:45 standby," she said. She didn't know why she said it. She wasn't looking for conversation. "I know," he said. "I looked at it." "You missed the 2214 too?" He looked at her then. Something moved briefly across his face. Not amusement exactly. Something more complicated. "No," he said. "I wasn't on it." He didn't explain further. Nora didn't ask. They sat in the particular companionable silence of 2 people in an airport at midnight who have both run out of energy for pretending that everything is fine. After a moment, he held out his coffee cup in her direction. "There's a place past security that's still open. They make it correctly." Nora looked at the cup. She looked at him. 9 years of night shift had given her a very accurate radar for people who meant harm and people who didn't. "I'm all right," she said. He withdrew the cup without offense. "Of course." Another silence. Then Nora said, "My mother's funeral is at 10. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out the way things came out at midnight in airports when you had been awake for 31 hours and the stabilizing phase was beginning to crack at the edges." The man was quiet for a moment. Then, "Portland time." "Yes." He picked up the coffee cup. He looked at it. He set it back down on his knee. "The 745 won't make it," he said. Not cruelly. Just factually, the way a person stated a fact when they had already done the same math and arrived at the same answer. "I know," Nora said. He turned to look at her fully then, for the first time. And she noticed, because she was a person who noticed things, it was both her professional gift and her private burden, that his expression had changed. Something behind his eyes had shifted, as if a door that had been closed had opened just a fraction. He held it there for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I have a plane." Pause here, because I want you to understand exactly what Nora Callahan heard when that sentence landed. She heard it the way any woman alone in an airport at midnight would hear it from a stranger she had known for 4 minutes. She heard the shape of it before she heard the meaning of it. She heard the pattern of it. A man, a woman, an offer, a problem conveniently solved, and every instinct that 9 years of night shifts had sharpened in her went completely still and alert. She also heard something else underneath it, something in the particular flatness of how he said it. Not "I have a plane" the way a man says something to impress a woman. More the way a person states a relevant fact when a fact is what the situation requires. She looked at him. "A plane," she repeated. "A small one," he said. 8 seats. It's at Midway. My pilot is on call." "You carry a private jet to airports," Nora said slowly. "And you're sitting in a plastic chair at gate 14B at midnight." Something crossed his face that might, under other circumstances, have been a smile. "I had a meeting nearby," he said. "I prefer to walk to gates." Nora studied him. "Who are you?" "My name is James," he said. "James Whitfield." She didn't recognize the name. She would later understand that this was somewhat like not recognizing the name of a mountain range. Not because the mountain range was obscure, but because Nora Callahan had spent 9 years in a world where the only names that mattered were on patient charts, and she had very deliberately not kept up with any other kind. "I'm not going to get on a stranger's plane," she said. "I understand," he said. "I don't know you." "You don't," he agreed. "This is." She stopped. She looked at the empty jetway. She looked back at him. "This is not how things work." "Usually not," he said. "But the 745 won't make 10 o'clock, and you should be at your mother's funeral." He said it simply, without drama, without the particular emotional leverage of a man who wants something. He said it the way a person stated a fact that mattered, and then he stopped talking and waited. Nora sat with it. She looked at her boarding pass. She looked at the dark window and the empty gate beyond it. She thought about her mother's hands. The way they had felt when Nora was small and sick and her mother would press one palm to her forehead and the other to her cheek, surrounding her face with warmth on both sides as if to say, "I am here. I have you. Nothing reaches you through me." She thought about missing the funeral. She thought about the cemetery 40 minutes from the airport in the November rain. She thought about standing at that grave alone 2 days later, long after everyone had gone, with nothing but the sound of rain on headstones and the knowledge that she had been 31 hours awake in a plastic chair 4 states away when her mother's casket was lowered into the ground. She picked up her carry-on. "If this is something other than what you said it is," she said, "I want you to know that I have worked nights for 9 years, and I have a very high tolerance for unpleasant situations and a very low tolerance for men who create them." "Understood," James Whitfield said, and stood up and picked up his own bag. The plane was exactly what he said it was. 8 seats, clean, understated, nothing ostentatious about it. No gold fixtures, no branded upholstery. No signal of wealth for the sake of signaling. Just a well-maintained cabin that smelled of leather and recycled air and the particular neutrality of a space that has been traveled in rather than shown off. The pilot, a woman in her 50s named Renata who had clearly been woken up, greeted them both with the professional warmth of someone who had done this before and would do it again and had long since stopped asking questions. James Whitfield took the seat nearest the window and opened a notebook. He did not speak to Nora again for most of the flight. He did not ask her questions. He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her that her mother was in a better place or that time healed things or any of the other sentences people assembled from available parts when they didn't know what else to do with someone's grief. He simply sat in his seat and wrote in his notebook and occasionally looked out at the dark below them and left Nora entirely alone with her own thoughts, which was, she would realize later, the most thoughtful thing he could possibly have done. She slept for 40 minutes over the Rockies. Not the desperate unconscious collapse of the plastic chair at gate 14B, but real sleep, the sleep of a body that had finally been given permission. She woke up as they were descending into Portland. The city was lit below them in the early morning dark, scattered and familiar, the grid of streets she had grown up navigating on a bicycle. She pressed her face briefly to the cold oval of the window and felt something shift in her chest that was partly grief and partly something she didn't have a name for yet. James Whitfield was still writing in his notebook. "Thank you," Nora said. He looked up. "Of course. I mean it. You didn't have to." "I know," he said. And the way he said it was not modest or deflecting. It was simply true. He knew he hadn't had to. He had chosen to. And the distinction, she understood, mattered to him in a way she didn't yet fully understand. She wanted to ask him something. She wasn't sure what. There was a quality to this man that she recognized in the way you recognized a song you had heard once a long time ago and couldn't quite place. Familiar in the bones without being familiar in the mind. But the plane was already banking left over the river and the runway lights were coming up through the dark below them and the moment passed before she could catch it. He didn't give her a business card. He didn't ask for her number. He stood when they landed and lifted his bag and said, simply, "I hope you make it in time. I'm sorry for your loss." And then he walked off the plane, and she didn't see which direction he went because she was already moving toward the taxi line with her carry-on and her boarding pass and the November rain coming down through the lights of Portland International in long gray curtains. She made it. She walked into the cemetery on Grove Hill Road at 9:58 a.m. Her brother Daniel was standing at the gate with an umbrella. He immediately held over her without asking. They didn't speak. They stood together in the rain while the pastor said the words that get said at the edge of graves, and Nora looked at the casket and thought about her mother's hands and tried very hard to stay in the stabilizing phase a little longer because she knew the moment she stopped stabilizing she was going to need a great deal of time to get back up. She made it through the service. She made it through the reception at Daniel's house. The casseroles and the condolences and the particular social machinery of grief that communities build to give the bereaved something to do with their hands. She did not think about James Whitfield again that day. She thought about him the next morning, standing in the kitchen of her mother's house with a cup of coffee she hadn't made yet, looking at the refrigerator covered in photographs, and noticing something that stopped her cold. Her mother's refrigerator was a document. 23 years of photographs layered over each other in the way they accumulate in the homes of women who love people and want to keep the evidence of that love visible. School pictures, holiday snapshots, birthday parties. Nora in her nursing graduation cap, Daniel at his wedding, her mother at various ages grinning into cameras with the unguarded joy of a person who was never self-conscious about being happy. And in the upper right corner, slightly overlapping a Christmas photo from 2019, a photograph Nora had never seen before. Her mother, perhaps 15 years younger than she had been when she died. standing in front of what appeared to be a building Nora didn't recognize. Smiling her mother's full smile, the one that took up her whole face, and next to her, arm not quite around her but close, the posture of two people who knew each other well but were being careful about it. A man. A man with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples. A man whose jaw was set but not hard. A man whose eyes, even in a photograph, were the specific color of patience. Nora set down her coffee cup. She picked up the photograph. It was tucked behind the others, not hidden exactly, but not prominent. A picture that had been lived with rather than displayed. She turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Jimmy, Portland General Fundraiser, 2009. Jimmy. She stood in her mother's kitchen for a very long time. Daniel didn't know much. He knew their mother had worked as a hospital administrator at Portland General for 11 years and had left in 2012 when the board changed and the new leadership decided her particular brand of patient advocacy was inconvenient to their financial model. He knew she had always spoken about those years with a combination of pride and a sadness she never fully explained. He knew she had occasionally mentioned a donor, a significant one, the kind that showed up in annual reports and never gave interviews, who had specifically funded the cardiac ward expansion she had spent 3 years fighting for. He did not know the donor's name. She never mentioned a James Whitfield? Nora asked. Daniel looked at her carefully. Where did you hear that name? Airport, Nora said. Long story. Her brother was a high school history teacher. He had the historian's habit of pausing before he spoke to make sure he was saying the right thing. The name James Whitfield, he said finally, is on the cardiac wing at Portland General. I've walked past it 100 times. I never put it together. Nora looked at the photograph in her hand. The cardiac wing her mother had fought for. The wing that, if her mother had stayed to see it open, she would have said was the thing she was most proud of in 11 years of hospital administration. The wing that had been funded by a quiet donor who never gave interviews and apparently, at some point, had stood next to her mother at a fundraiser and let her call him Jimmy. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it in her coat pocket. Now I want to pause here and name something that this story is doing beneath its surface, because there is a structure to what James Whitfield had done that goes beyond generosity and into something more specific. He had not attended the funeral as a public gesture. There would be no news coverage, no press release, no photograph of the billionaire paying his respects. He had not sent flowers with his name on them. He had not called Daniel. He had not, as far as Nora could determine, told anyone at all that he was in Portland or why. He had simply shown up at an airport gate at midnight and quietly arranged for a dead woman's daughter to make it home in time. There is a concept in moral philosophy called anonymous beneficence. The idea that the purest form of generosity is the kind given with no witness, no record, and no expectation of acknowledgement. Not because the giver is performing humility, but because the gift was never about the giver to begin with. What James Whitfield had done at Gate 14B was not a gesture toward Nora. It was a gesture toward her mother. The last thing he could do for a woman he had loved like his own. Make sure her daughter was standing at the graveside. That distinction is the engine of everything that follows. She found him 3 days later. Not by asking around, not by Googling, though she did Google and the results were considerable, and she stood in her mother's kitchen reading them with the same expression she imagined she would wear if the refrigerator had suddenly started explaining quantum physics. She found him because she went to Portland General. She went to the cardiac wing. She walked the corridor her mother had spent 3 years fighting to build, past the rooms her mother had argued should have better staffing ratios and better lighting and windows that opened wide enough for actual air to come through. She read the placard on the wall. Whitfield Cardiac Center. established 2013. In dedication to the belief that every patient deserves to be seen. She read the last sentence again. In dedication to the belief that every patient deserves to be seen. She sat down in the hallway on a bench outside the nurse's station and put her hands in her lap and looked at that sentence for a long time. She had spent 9 years in cardiac nursing. She had chosen cardiac specifically, and she had never, not once in 9 years, been asked to articulate why. She had never been able to. Every time she tried, the answer came out too large for the words available. But someone had put it on a wall in 8 words and gotten it exactly right. Every patient deserves to be seen. She found the administration office. She asked, without explaining who she was or why, whether Mr. Whitfield had any local contact she could reach. The administrator looked at her the way administrators looked at people who asked questions like that and said that Mr. Whitfield was a private donor who did not maintain a public office at the hospital. Nora thanked her and walked back out into the corridor. She stood outside the cardiac wing for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called the only number she had for him, the one Renata the pilot had given her at Portland International in case she needed anything, in the practiced way of someone who had been instructed to make sure the passenger had a way to reach them. It rang 4 times. Nora, he said. She hadn't told him her name. She had never told him her name. You knew who I was, she said. At the gate. A pause. Not guilty. Not evasive. Just honest. Yes. You knew my mother. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. She leaned against the wall of the corridor that her mother had fought for and looked at the placard that James Whitfield had paid for and thought about a woman who had spent her whole life making sure other people had what they needed, and a man who had apparently spent 15 years making sure a hospital corridor stayed lit in her honor. I want to know, Nora said. Everything. I want to know who she was to you. Another pause. Longer this time. She was the most honest person I ever met, he said. He was in Portland. Of course he was in Portland. She would later understand that he had been in Portland since the day of the funeral, staying at a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital, doing whatever it was that James Whitfield did in cities he visited, which turned out to be a great deal less than what people assumed, and a great deal more of sitting quietly in rooms and thinking. They met at a coffee shop on Burnside. Not a remarkable one. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and jazz playing at a volume that allowed conversation without broadcasting it. He was already there when she arrived. He was doing what she had found him doing at gate 14B. Sitting with no phone in hand, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee, entirely comfortable being still. She sat across from him. For a moment they looked at each other with the particular adjustment of 2 people recalibrating who the other person was against who they had thought. Then he told her. He had met her mother in 2007. He was 38 years old, which meant he was not yet what the newspapers would later describe him as. He was well on his way. The first company had done well, the second was growing faster than anyone had predicted. But he was still, in the ways that mattered, recognizable as the person he had started as. A man who had grown up with very little in a part of Oregon that didn't appear in travel magazines, who had built something from almost nothing through a combination of intelligence and the particular stubbornness of people who are told early that they are not the kind of person things happen for. He had been in the cardiac unit at Portland General. Not as a donor. Not as a board member. As a patient. He had been 38 years old, and he had gone in for what he thought was a pulled muscle from a flight, and it had turned out to be the early stage of a condition that, if unaddressed, would have killed him before he was 45. It was caught because a hospital administrator had noticed that he had been brought in on a Friday evening without his usual assistant and without anyone to contact, and had flagged him for additional monitoring because, as she later explained, patients who have no one to call tend to leave before they should. He had tried to leave after 12 hours. She had sat down across from him in his hospital room and said, without any particular ceremony, "Mr. Whitfield, you have a heart that is working harder than it should. I understand you have things to do. So does everyone in this ward. They're all still here." He had stayed 4 days. She visited him each morning. Not as part of her job, visiting patients was not, strictly speaking, within the scope of a hospital administrator. She visited him because she had decided, with the particular directness that apparently characterized everything she did, that he was a person who needed someone to talk to and wasn't going to ask for it. She was right. He had never said this out loud before, James Whitfield told Nora, looking at his coffee cup. But those 4 days in a hospital room with a woman who asked him direct questions and listened to the actual answers rather than the ones he had learned to give were the 4 days in which he had become a slightly different person. A better one, he thought. A person who, on day 3, when the cardiologist explained exactly how close the margin had been, had sat alone for an hour and then called his lawyer and changed a document that needed changing. Not a will, a deed. He had owned a piece of land in eastern Oregon that had been in his family and that he had never done anything with because he had spent 15 years building forward and never looking back. He had transferred it that day to a land trust that would preserve it in perpetuity. Her mother had asked him on day 4 why. "Because you told me that patients who have no one tend to leave too soon," he had said. "And I've been leaving things too soon my whole life." She had looked at him for a long moment, with the expression that Nora, listening to this across a coffee shop table, recognized precisely because she had seen it in the mirror, the expression of a woman absorbing something true. Then she had said, "You should come back when you're not a patient." They had been, and here James Whitfield paused for a longer time than he had paused for anything else, choosing the word with the care of someone who understood that the wrong word would reduce something that didn't deserve reduction. Close for 7 years. Not romantically or not only. He was careful about that. Her mother had been widowed when Nora was 11 and Daniel was 8, and she had the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who had rebuilt her life twice already and was not looking to rebuild it a third time around someone else's schedule. But close. Close in the way that some people are close who have recognized in each other something that the rest of the world doesn't see. A particular frequency, a shared conviction about what mattered and what didn't. He had funded the cardiac wing because she had asked him to, not in the way people asked billionaires to fund things, with proposals and presentations and carefully assembled arguments. She had simply told him, over coffee, that the hospital was going to lose the expansion because the board had decided cardiac care was not sufficiently revenue-generating, and that there were 78 patients currently on a wait list for procedures that a properly equipped wing could offer within the year. 78, she had said. Not a general number. 78 specific people. He had written the check the following week. When the new board had pushed her out in 2012, he had offered to intervene. She had declined. "I don't need someone to fight my battles," she had told him. "I need the battles to produce something that lasts after I'm gone." The wing was still there. The dedication was still on the wall. 78 people had become, in the decade since, several hundred. She had been right about what lasted. She died in September. He had known she was sick. She had told him, with the same directness she brought to everything, in July. He had flown to Portland 3 times in August. He had sat with her in the house on Maple Street, the one covered in photographs, and they had drunk tea and talked about the things that get talked about when time is finite and honesty is the only protocol. She had told him about Nora, about Daniel, about the daughter who worked nights on a cardiac ward because she had grown up watching her mother believe that patients deserved to be seen, and had decided to go and do the seeing herself. She had said quietly that she was proud of Nora in a way she hadn't always shown. that the nights had kept them apart more than she had admitted, that she had meant to say more of the things and hadn't, and that was the one regret she was carrying. James Whitfield had told her that Nora knew, that daughters always knew, even when the words didn't come. Her mother had looked at him with the expression that, he now told Nora, was the expression of someone deciding whether or not to believe something they very much wanted to be true. He hoped she had believed it. He had been at the airport in Chicago not by coincidence and not entirely by design. He had been at a meeting genuinely. But he had also known which flight Nora was booked on because she had called the hospital the week before asking about her mother's medical records. A call that had been routed to the administrative office, which had flagged it and mentioned it to him because he was still, quietly, a donor of enough significance that certain things were mentioned. He had been at O'Hare. He had done the math that Nora had not yet done about the implications of a delayed flight and a 10 a.m. funeral. He had gone to gate 14B. He had not planned to speak to her. He had thought, he admitted, that he would simply ensure she made the flight. That if the gate agent needed to hold the boarding 30 seconds for a passenger running late from another terminal, certain calls could be made. Quietly, without Nora ever knowing. But she had been asleep in the plastic chair and the gate had closed and there was no quiet phone call that undid a closed gate. And so he had waited and she had woken up and he had said the word Portland because it was the only word he had. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Nora asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you were a woman in an airport who had just missed the last flight to her mother's funeral. You didn't need information. You needed a plane." Nora sat with that. "And after? On the flight? You could have told me then. You needed to sleep. And at the airport in Portland. You could have. You needed to get to the cemetery." She looked at him. "You kept not telling me," she said slowly, "because there was always something I needed more than the truth." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More the acknowledgement of someone who has been seen accurately. "Your mother used to do that," he said. "Identify exactly what a situation required. Not what would be easiest for her to give. What the situation actually required." Nora looked at her coffee cup. "I know," she said. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that is populated with things that don't need to be said. "She talked about you," he said. "More than you probably know. She said you were the best version of everything she'd tried to be." Nora pressed her lips together. She was a cardiac nurse. She knew how to manage acute phases. She managed this one. Just barely. "She should have told me that," she said when she could. "Yes," he agreed. "She should have." No softening. No, but she meant to, or in her own way she. Just yes. She should have. Nora looked up at him. "You're very direct for someone who spent 2 days not telling me who you were." "Those were operational decisions," he said. "This is a conversation." And despite everything, despite the 31 hours awake and the missed flight and the funeral in the rain and the photograph on the refrigerator and all the accumulated weight of the last 4 days, Nora Callahan laughed. A real one. The first one since the call at 5:52 a.m. Came and went quickly the way the first ones do after grief. But it came. They sat in the coffee shop on Burnside for 2 hours. He told her more about her mother. Not the details Nora already knew, the public shape of her mother's life, the career, the milestones, but the smaller things. The way her mother took her coffee, which was black with 1 sugar, and which she always made incorrectly because she added the sugar after the coffee was already cold and then didn't stir it. So the last sip was always too sweet. The books she kept beside the chair in the living room, always 3 or 4 on the go, always with receipts used as bookmarks because she found proper bookmarks too deliberate. The fact that she had, in her late 50s, taken up bird watching with the dedication of someone who had found a thing they were good at and intended to be excellent at it, and had developed opinions about binoculars that were, James said with something approaching wonder, frankly astonishing in their specificity. Nora knew the coffee thing. She had forgotten about the receipts. She had not known about the birds. She told him things in return. Not deliberately at first, but the conversation had a quality that her mother's conversations, she realized, had also had. It created space in which things that were true became easy to say. She told him about the nights, about the 3 a.m. hand-holding, about the particular silence after monitors flatlined that she had memorized and had never once gotten used to, about the patient 3 years ago who had grabbed her wrist on his last coherent night and said, "I just need someone to know I was here," and how she had sat with him for an hour past the end of her shift because she understood, in a way that was physical, that this was what the whole job was for. James Whitfield listened to this with the focused attention of a man who had learned, from a woman who was very good at it, how to actually listen. "She was right," he said when Nora stopped talking. "About you. She never told me she was proud of me," Nora said. "Came out without warning. Plain and factual and full of a grief that had been waiting patiently behind the clinical management." "I know," he said. "She told me. She told me she thought you knew without being told. I told her she should tell you anyway. Did she say why she didn't?" "She said she was afraid you'd stop." Nora looked at him. "Stop what?" "Being the person she was proud of." He set down his cup. "She thought if she said it out loud, you'd feel it was complete, that you'd done the thing and it was finished. She wanted you to keep going." Nora sat with that for a long time. It was not a satisfying explanation. It was not the right choice. It was, however, a completely recognizable one. The logic of a woman who loved so specifically that she had thought through even the consequences of her praise and made a calculation based on her daughter's well-being that she had never shared with her daughter. A calculation that kept Nora in the dark for years because it was made entirely in the light of love. "She should have told me," Nora said again, quieter this time. "Yes," James Whitfield said again. "She should have." She flew back to Chicago on a commercial flight 2 days later. Back to Northwestern Memorial. Back to the nights, the corridors, the 3 a.m. hand-holding, the silence after flatlines. Before she left, she went back to the cardiac wing at Portland General. She stood in front of the placard again. Whitfield Cardiac Center. In dedication to the belief that every patient deserves to be seen. She thought about the woman who had sat across from a 38-year-old man in a hospital room and told him that patients who had no one tended to leave too soon. Who had identified, with the accuracy that apparently defined her, that what he needed was not a diagnosis but a conversation. Who had, in doing so, changed the direction of a life that would eventually fund a wing in which several hundred people received care they otherwise might not have. Who had never put her name on any of it. Who had left it to a placard with someone else's name and 8 words that were entirely hers. Nora stood in that corridor for a long time. Then she took out her phone and called her brother. "Daniel," she said, "do you know if the hospital has a volunteer program? For people who want to contribute something." Her brother, who was a historian and therefore careful with language, said, "What kind of contribution are you thinking?" Nora looked at the placard. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I think Mom would know." 6 months later, the night shift at Portland General's cardiac wing had a new volunteer coordinator. A woman who came in twice a week and sat with the patients who had no one to call, who held hands at 3 a.m., who memorized the silence after monitors flatlined and had learned, over 9 years, how to walk back out of that silence and into the next room. She had transferred from Northwestern Memorial. It was a lateral move, technically, the kind that made her colleagues ask careful questions about whether she was all right, whether the grief had been too much, whether she needed time. She told them she was fine. She told them it wasn't grief that brought her here, or not only grief. It was instructions, she said. Her mother had left them in the margins. In 8 words on a wall and a photograph tucked behind a Christmas photo, and the cold dark shape of Oregon visible through an oval window as a small plane banked left over the river on a November morning. Every patient deserves to be seen. Nora Callahan had grown up watching someone believe that. She had spent 9 years going and doing the seeing herself in a different city under different fluorescent lights on a different night shift. She was home now. She was finishing what her mother had started. And somewhere across the city, in a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital that had become, quietly and without announcement, something closer to a base than a hotel, a man was sitting in a room with a notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold on the windowsill. He was not looking at the city. He was reading a text message that had arrived at 3:47 a.m. from a number saved in his phone under a single name. I started tonight. I think she would have liked it. James Whitfield looked at that message for a long time. Then he picked up his pen, and he wrote in the notebook something he had been trying to find the words for 15 years, and he finally had them, because a woman he had loved like his own had sent them to him through her daughter at 3:47 in the morning from a cardiac ward in Portland. He wrote, she would have. He set down the pen. He picked up his coffee. He looked out at the city. He felt, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, exactly where he was supposed to be. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Nora and James moved something in you, if you thought of someone you should have told something to, or something you should have finished, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. New stories arrive every week. Don't miss the next one.